All right. Well, I will get started with a little bit of the background here on kind of how we came to be where we are today with Sister Lynn and Sister Nancy on this webinar. So thank you everyone who's been able to join us so far, and some may come in a little later, but I'm Julie Heiberger. I'm the religious market leader here at Hoffman Planning, Design, and Construction based in Appleton, Wisconsin. We've been working with many different communities over the years, and how this webinar came to be was we were trying to figure out, Sister Nancy and I, how do we get our arms around this COVID situation that we were dealing with early back in May, end of April and May, understanding that we as a company have seen a difference in, sisters either having to pause current planning efforts or understanding sisters that had a lot of care facilities or mother houses with elderly sisters, that was the priority at the time, is to keep them safe. And we were really trying to get our hands and our minds around what really the challenges of the communities were. So our thought was to do a survey, to ask some questions of the various leadership teams that we've been blessed to have worked in the past and that we are working with currently, to kind of get an understanding from the leadership perspective what they were dealing with. So what information have they been able to get? Are they getting enough information? So on and so forth. And then also get a better feeling of what the sisters themselves, that they were hearing feedback from their communities on what was challenging for them. So we could just figure out, is there any way that we can help? Not necessarily buildings, not necessarily anything, but was there other topics that we could maybe help and get information regarding? So as the survey results came back, the topic that probably had the most interest was the impact on this current situation on the sisters and the members of the communities. So luckily, Sister Nancy, who is kind of working with Hoffman as a facilitator, consulting with us on projects now, knew Sister Lynn. So Sister Nancy reached out to Lynn to see if she would be interested in doing this, and here we are today. So we're very excited to be able to put this together and bring this very important topic discussion to you all. So I'm going to let Sister Nancy kind of introduce Lynn, and we'll kind of go on from there. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and here we go.
Thanks, Julie. I want to add my welcome to that which Julie has just offered you. And as you know from the short bio of Lynn, which was part of the invitation to this webinar, we're about to spend a little bit more than an hour with a well-qualified and highly sought-after presenter. And while many of you are here today because you know Lynn, you've heard her speak, or you've read an article that Lynn has written, let me say just a couple things about Lynn for those of you who have not yet met her. Lynn is a consulting psychologist in private practice who works both nationally and internationally with religious congregations and healthcare systems. As Julie just said, we at Hoffman chose this topic because many of you told us it was important to you. And as we began to work on this webinar with Lynn, we began to understand the wide scope of interest that this topic really has. The Journal of the American Medical Association just recently published an article about this very same topic with research that was done on residents of nursing homes. So we knew we are on target with the right topic, and I'm here to say we're on target with the right presenter as well. I'm saying that we all know what Lynn's professional qualifications are, but I also want to say to you what I know is that Lynn cares deeply about the women and men who are the subject of this webinar today. She cares about them personally, just as you do. They're not nameless faces for Lynn, they're real people. Also, Lynn shares with many of you the experience of being in leadership. Lynn is the former congregation leader for the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet. And with all of you who are here today, who are in some level, at some capacity, making decisions, difficult ones, that impact the lives of those being served, Lynn understands the pressures and stresses of being in that role. So we're in for a treat. Let me just say two things about the structure of today. One is that as you can see on the handout that Lynn provided, when Lynn is about to shift topics or shift the focus of her presentation, she'll pause and offer you a couple guide questions just for some quiet time for you personally. The second thing I want to say is we're unsure exactly how many people are participating in this webinar, but we know it's in excess of 600 people. We had to make the difficult decision that we are not going to entertain questions from individual participants today. There's just simply no way to field, group, get those questions to Lynn, and for Lynn to have the time that those questions really deserve. However, as Julie mentioned earlier, there will be a survey coming to you soon where you can document the questions that you might have wanted to ask. So I'd encourage you to write them down so that when you get the survey, you can submit them. But Julie will come back around after Lynn has finished and she'll give you some more specifics about that. So that being said, please join me in welcoming Sister Lynn Levo, PhD. Lynn, it's yours.
Thank you, Nancy. I'd like to begin with that small phrase from Hosea. The Holy One has tended us from our youth, was our healer when we did not even know it, is present with us still, and will not let trials and tribulations consume us. What better time than now during this pandemic to hear Hosea and be reminded that in the midst of this unknown and frightening virus, that our loving God is with us still. I'm happy to be with you, and we can tell from the response that how COVID-19 is impacting our communal life is of interest and concern to many of you, especially for community leaders and for all those who co-labor in our communities, ultimately for the care and well-being of our members and all those who care for them in any way. Today's presentation will be in 3 parts. The first part, I'm just going to do a brief as what do we know about COVID-19, and the operative word is today, because it keeps evolving. The second part is what are the ways of coping with this virus? What can you expect personally, communally? And when we know what to expect, we can be more prepared and feel more comfortable in responding, even though some of what we expect can be challenging. And then the third area will be some suggestions for leading at a time of crisis, because many of you will have the added responsibility of caring for others while you're also doing your own journey and caring for yourself. So to begin with, a few words about what do we know today about this novel virus. This is one of the worst pandemics in the past 100 years. The whole world is facing a massive threat, and we cannot play it down or pretend it isn't happening. Truly, the virus has altered the way we live and work. We are in uncharted territory, and in particular, it's uncharacteristic because of 2 factors. First of all, it's a global novel virus. And secondly, for us and for many, the increased life expectancy of many adults. And because of the increased life expectancy, many of our older persons and many in our community have increased vulnerability because of advanced age, underlying conditions, and compromised immune systems. We're learning almost daily how the virus is spread. Most recently, you've been hearing about airborne spreading, and therefore there's much more emphasis now on masks and face covering and social distancing. The mitigating social strategies of social distancing isn't interesting. We have a whole new language, the mitigating strategies of social distancing. Social distancing, hand washing, and mask or face coverings are working if together we are faithful to them. there are lots of uncertainties, and we hear them every day. Will you be immune after an infection? When and will there be a useful, and the other word is safe, vaccine? How long do we need to social distance? What is the impact of social distancing and quarantine on individual physical, mental, and spiritual health? And how does uncertainty, and we're dealing with a tremendous amount of it, impact well-being? That's really going to be the major part of our conversation. The virus has also exposed gaps in and injustices in our care system. Our technical capacities are not up to what they need to be, and that includes communities are frequently challenged to provide technological means of connecting. There's a disproportionate impact on people of color and older adults. And that includes not only our sisters, but the relatives of our sisters whom they care deeply about. And one final note, there is truly a lack of a sound national strategy based on science and facts to combat the virus, and the failure of leadership are factors that are impacting the spread and the lack of containment and the increase of uncertainty and fear. So just pause for a moment. Those are some of the things we know. And every day as I read and listen to the news, we discover some new things. I'd like next to talk about coping with COVID-19. What do we know and what are we learning? Because this is really a time of learning as well. Adapting to a new way of life, which is what we're all doing, has been difficult, with the severity of impact differing for each individual person. And that's one of the challenges. How is it impacting me? How is it impacting this particular sister or brother? Individuals with previous mental health conditions and or cognitive decline may easily be more challenged by the virus and by the methods of mitigation, quarantine, and isolation. This next sentence is so important. Educating members about what to expect and affirming their experience is going to be quite important in the days now and to come. Affirming their experience really is so important. And what we're understanding is that their ordinary responses, or their responses are ordinary to what we would call an extraordinary situation. So what do we know people are experiencing? The first thing, and you're going to hear me talk a lot about different feelings because this is at the heart of where the experience is being felt. First, we have a fair amount of panic and fear. And when we think about it, it is a first reaction. And in particular, it's a first reaction now because of the magnitude of the situation. In this country alone, we're seeing the rise of both the virus and the deaths. So it's hugely impacting our life and the world's life. At the same time, it's also leads us to feel overwhelmed, unsafe, paralyzed, vulnerable, and even helpless. And part of that is related to the fact that it's so big, and part of it is because it's so new and we don't know a lot. We're in this really learning time. A second big response, which is denial. And really, denial is a defense mechanism used to buffer the intensity of uncertainty and fear. And so haven't we heard from different folks, oh, it's just the flu? Or even within a community, you might hear, oh, the leaders are just overreacting. And part of that is not true, but you can understand why people are saying, oh, that you're just overreacting. And so one of the things we're learning is that denial has both a psychological component and a cultural component. Now I'm speaking particularly to the people in the US right now. And one of the things that's true from a psychological perspective is some of us can have what we call an unrealistic optimism bias. Now, the word optimism is a word that we're going to really not encourage you. We're going to really substitute hope in its place, because optimism is not reality based. And that's why an unrealistic optimism bias is not paying attention to the reality. So that's one of the issues. Also, there is an underplaying of the threat of seeing oneself as at risk. And so what we have here then is a denial which is not helpful for us, because we're not facing the vulnerability that we really are experiencing. So we tend to, especially in the US, have a sense of invulnerability. And at the same time, we also don't want to deal with difficult feelings. So let me say something about denial that is true. It is healthy when temporary, and it needs to give way. And that's what we're going to talk about next, to all these other feelings that we are so important to feel. And the important feelings are sadness and anxiety and grief and anger and fear, which are typical responses to uncertainty and vulnerability, which is our lived reality right now. Another thing that we're experiencing is called caution fatigue. And this is a mix of being isolated, disrupted routines. I can't speak highly enough, sisters and brothers, that routines help us. They help us cope with uncertainty, and they create a sense of, I have something to say about my life. And now our routines are disrupted. Stress and anxiety leave us drained and tired, and may lead to a gradual decline in safety behaviors. I've talked to a few superiors, a few leaders who have said some of their sisters are saying, well, we can go out shopping as long as we wear our masks. Well, that's pretty risky right now. And depending on what part of the country you're in, it's even more risky. And so we don't want our folks engaging in less than safe behaviors. And we also want them to be about self-care and care for others. Confusion is clearly happening all around us, and it comes often because of conflicting and evolving information. And those are not the same thing. Our information is evolving. Yes, it was true. At the beginning, everyone wearing a mask was not encouraged. We now know that mask wearing or face covering are very important if we want to mitigate this virus. So it isn't that somebody's not telling the truth, it's a fact that our information has changed. However, we are also getting conflicting information, and sometimes from leaders who are giving us conflicting information, and therefore one of the things that's happening is a distrust of leadership. That's one thing you don't want to have happen within your own community. Losing trust, pretty hard to regain. And a lot of what we're going to talk about when I talk about leadership is how to be trustworthy and how to, in fact, instill trust in your members. The next one, loss and sadness and grief, are huge among us. I recently talked to a group of women religious about this topic, and one of the sisters, when there was a little opportunity for feedback, came to the microphone with tears and said, I've been feeling so sad, and I thought there was something wrong with me. Of course, there's sadness. And one of the reasons why there's sadness is there's a good little link you want to keep remembering. Change involves loss, and loss leads us to feeling sadness and even deeper feelings or mixed feelings called grief. We are coping with a number of different kinds of loss, personal and communal. Just think of this list: the loss of life we knew, the loss of structure, even the fact that we don't have mass daily, at least many of us don't, that we don't have meals together, that we don't sit and watch TV together, that it's been a loss of a relational life, a life with friends, a life with family, a life with community members. And also, two very important things I think we're going to need to understand and explore more: touch and ritual. Touch hunger, touch need is really significant. We really need to touch and be touched. And yet, that is one of the things that is really we're being very cautious about. And also the importance of ritual. Again, I think as we live into this, we're understanding the importance of ritual. Ritual is part of how we have an identity. You know, we do these things, we celebrate jubilees in this way, we have assemblies or chapters in this way. And it's also not only a communal source of identity, but personal source of identity. I'll say this again later, but for all those of you who are in a position to help others, really encouraging every person, every member to create her own or his own ritual will be helpful, because you have some control over that, and that can help alleviate anxiety. The next thing I'm going to talk about is probably the biggest area of concern that is happening in and around all of the writings done in the field of psychology and psychiatry, and that is the whole question of loneliness. This is a huge thing. When we talk about loneliness, what do we mean? Well, it's this subjective. It's how I feel alone. I don't feel connected. I feel a loss or a lack of connectedness. And what's interesting is, how do I experience that? You may not have your sisters saying, I feel lonely. And sometimes I think we have to give permission to feel lonely. I think we sometimes think there's something wrong if we feel lonely. But how is loneliness experienced? You might not hear the word lonely, but what you might hear is, I feel anxious, or you might hear, I'm dissatisfied. Nothing is right. You know, the food isn't okay, this isn't right. So dissatisfaction with daily life. And what can happen with loneliness? It can lead to a chronic, heightened stress response. And this is where this chronic, ongoing, heightened stress response can have a negative effect on mental health and on well-being. And so what are we learning? And some of the learning is from what's happening in nursing homes, but it's also happening in other places, that this chronic heightened stress response directly related to loneliness is leading for some men and women to be depressed. Now, it's interesting, women usually get depressed by turning themselves in and withdrawing. For the men online, men can be more aggressive, more angry, more frustrated as a way of being depressed, which is interesting. We're learning about some differences between men and women. Cognitive decline is a possibility here, where a person who seemed to be pretty able to make decisions for herself, take care of herself or himself, is now having difficulty. So loneliness, stress, cognitive decline. Dementia can be increased or exacerbated. Also, we're looking at, for those of our men and women who are diabetic, worsening diabetes control, overeating, heart disease, and a negative impact on the immune system, which can create more problems. And finally, an increase in self-neglect, not caring for self. So those are some things you may want to look for. And the person may not be using the word loneliness, but in fact, those are some of the signs that may be his or her experience. So important to remember that when we lose a sense of connection and community, that our perception of the world can change, that we don't experience safety, and we have increased dissatisfaction. And it can be about small things that didn't bother people in the past. Interestingly enough, the research literature is saying right now that loneliness is a public health crisis. Loneliness is a public health crisis. And why is that so? Because it's impacting so many. And because there are so many adverse health effects due to loneliness and that heightened stress response that can come from an experience of loneliness. Now, for us women and men religious, we need to remember a couple other things about loneliness. Loneliness can be experienced at any age, and it is. Some of our young people are lonely, and we need to help them with that. It is also true that older persons are particularly vulnerable. This can be compounded, or when I say this, loneliness can be compounded by other causes of loneliness that may be being experienced by some of our community members. And it's directly related to advanced age and the need to be understood and addressed. These need to be understood. So what are some of the things that can impact or add to loneliness? The first is life changes. Some women who used to be so active are less active. Excuse me. Physical changes, including changes to sight and hearing and stamina, where I'm not the person I was. And that can lead to even a withdrawal or an isolation. And then also, so important for us as women and men religious, the loss of significant relationships. And that is happening through the death of community members, through the death of family members, etc. And so it's so important that we understand that loneliness can be compounded by the very ages and stage of life that our women and men are in. The next big emotional response that is felt by so many is anxiety. Anxiety. And it's a major response. Anxiety is a major response and a typical response because it is in response to uncertainty of so much. And we are living with a tremendous amount of uncertainty that seems to get compounded almost daily. So when we talk about anxiety, what do we mean? Well, it's a feeling of agitation, of dread, of foreboding. Another way to look at it is future-oriented fear, because it's really associated that there's a danger coming tomorrow or next week or next year or 2 hours from now. Fear is a present feeling. Anxiety is that it's not quite here yet, but it has all the same impact. What anxiety does, it keeps us on high alert, a stress response. And at its core is the belief that I will not be okay, that I'm not going to be safe. And interestingly enough, I'm not going to be physically safe. I'm not going to be emotionally safe. And even I'm not going to be spiritually safe. I talked to an older person the other day who said to me, "Where's God in this?" So even wondering or questioning where God is can be a part of this anxiousness that we feel. I think it's important to understand how people show us they're anxious, because sometimes people are not using these words. So there are 3 big areas that people show us how they're anxious. The first one is when a person, me, you, have what we call intrusive thinking or intrusive thoughts. Another word that is frequently used here that we're seeing people talk about is a person who is ruminating, going over and over and over the same thing. Worry is a way of manifesting anxiety. And if you understand worry, and I found this really helpful more recently to understand what is worry. Worry is an act of the imagination where we expect the worst. Let me say that again. Worry is an act of the imagination where we expect the worst. And so you say, And by the way, if you know, this isn't just our members. Recently, I had the opportunity to talk with a leadership team, and one of the women, just as honest as she could be, said, "I didn't realize that my going over and over things was really a manifestation of my being anxious. And I was imagining the worst. And so one of the things we can all do when we find ourselves in a worrying, going over and over something, is to stop, which is easier said than done, but to stop worrying. And by the way, another little antidote or another little response is, what if you took some time to imagine the best, not simply imagining the worst? It can shake us out of this imagining the worst. And by the way, what's worry about? It's really an effort to control. And to be truthful, in so many areas, we're not in control. And facing that and walking with each other is going to be very helpful. I want to talk about the physical responses. That's the second area. That's what we call somatic or body symptoms or physical symptoms. These are very personal. It depends on your own journey. Tightness in the chest, having a hard time swallowing, constricted throat. Shallow breathing is very, very common. Having a hard time catching your breath. An antsy feeling. You can't sit still. That's one of mine. I kind of can't quite sit still. Even this morning in morning prayer, I said to myself, all right, come on, we can just take a few breaths here, and then focused on the gospel that we were praying. Insomnia, it often impacts sleep, and I'm going to talk about that. Dry mouth, some people get headaches, some people have a rapid heartbeat, and some people have digestive issues, or sweating can be a part of it. I think one of the biggest things we can learn, and this is an important learning, and I'm going to ask you to join me in this, is really when we feel anxious, one of the things to do is to learn to breathe to calm. Let me say that again. Learning how to breathe to calm. And you can do this yourself, and we can help our brothers and sisters do this. So I'd like you to join me in a little experiment here. What we're going to do, I'm going to describe it first, and then we'll do it together. What we're learning is there is a way of breathing to calm, and here's what it looks like. You inhale through your nose, and you hold that for 4 seconds. Then you hold it, you breathe in for 4 seconds. So you breathe in for 4 seconds, then you hold for 4 seconds, and then you breathe out through the imaginary straw in your mouth, and you breathe out for 8 seconds. So interestingly enough, we're breathing in, then holding, then breathing out for 8 seconds. The out breath is longer. And it's important to practice this kind of breathing. And by the way, usually to do it about 10 times, and not rushing, but doing it about 10. So let's do a little practice. I'm going to talk you through. So if everybody were to breathe in through your nose, and I'm going to count to 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold for 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And breathe out through that imaginary straw in your mouth. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If we did that, especially when we have real anxiety coming on, it's very simple to do it. 10 times is the recommendation. One of the things we're learning about our bodies is that there's a brain-gut connection. Brain-gut connection. And so what do we know? When anxious, our bodies respond with nausea, indigestion, heartburn. Some people have diarrhea, all of that. And so that's one thing. When that is happening, you might say, is this an experience of me being anxious? And then the other way around is also true. When our digestive system is disrupted, it can cause us to feel anxious. So the mind-gut connection is huge, the brain-gut connection, and we're learning every day about that, including some of the autoimmune diseases that are associated with that. I'd like to talk about nighttime anxiety. Waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning and unable to fall back to sleep often is a good sign of anxiety. And so being able to name that and to be able to say, oh, that's what that is. Also, it is true that some people have difficulty falling asleep, and that's because they are ruminating. They're going over and over and over. And so sometimes our body and everything about us is trying to say, you're anxious. And better that you pause and name the anxiety in your wake life, and then be able to be calming and understand it than taking it to bed at night. I want to talk about behavioral symptoms. That's the third piece. So we talked about intrusive thinking, we talked about somatic or body symptoms, and now we want to talk about behavioral symptoms. These are often not connected to anxiety. So listen to what they are: anger, irritation, demanding perfection, compulsive behaviors, that can include eating or exercising or whatever. These are all attempts to reassure, to control, and to comfort, but they don't work. So it's a false sense of comfort, especially like, for example, if you eat sugar as a way, in compulsive way, you kind of get a little buzz on. And alcohol could do that too. But it's really a false sense of comfort, because this is not a time of comfort. So we can be fooled into really even reacting to others and thinking it's about them. And that is something we really need to get better at, especially those of us or anybody in leadership. When you find yourself reacting to somebody, I'm irritated with her, or there she goes again, or they're doing this again, one of the things you want to do is pause, and what I call, and what Tara Brach calls, doing a U-turn. We have to realize that, yes, they may be doing something, but the irritation, frustration, anger is mine. And you want to understand that so that you are able to respond and not react. The final piece here that I'd like to talk about is action. That some people respond by acting. Now, this differs with generations and also with personal experiences. So we saw, and I think this was more from older adults, perhaps the boomers and a little bit later, rushing to stockpile necessities. And so as with even other experiences like tornadoes, fear and control become motivators to go and collect everything that we can possibly buy. And we buy more than we need, and therefore I have what I need, but you don't have what you need. So stockpiling is one response. Another response is being creative. There are several communities, including my own province here in New York, where our sisters sewed masks, face coverings, and made them and gave them away to provide something safe coverings for men and women, some of whom work for us, others were given to other people. The third area that I just found it's under creativity, but I found so touching, was the playing of music from the balconies. This certainly happened, it started in Italy, and the playing of music or the singing of opera from the balconies. But also it happened in New York City. If you remember, I'm from New York, I live in upstate New York, but New York City was hit so terribly, as you know, in the early parts of this pandemic, and people singing and performing on the balconies. Using my energy for a greater good, helping others, is a way to cope with stress. Focusing on others, not just myself, is a way of coping with stress. So, and then even protesting mask wearing, even though that is not the healthiest response right now. But I would suspect that underneath the protesting of mask wearing, underneath is real fear. And rather than facing the fact that I'm afraid, what happens here is I sort of project it out and talk about, you're making me do this, or the rights I have, for example. I think with action, I think it's really important for any of us who have any kind of role as a caregiver or caring for others. One of the things, one type of action that is important, and it's somewhat reason why you're here, is getting some help. I think to assume that it's only up to you is a poor, poor way of going about this incredible thing that we're all facing. One last area and this section about what's it like? What are people experiencing? What are typical responses to this incredible thing that's happening to us, this new thing that's happening to us that's so global and all-encompassing? Some of you may have members who are recovering from COVID-19. So in addition, and it depends really on what their experience was and what treatment they experienced, because the different treatments have different impacts. In addition to the coping strategies we just talked about, anxiousness, somatic issues, irritability, and frustration, fear, all of that could be present. Members recovering from Corona-19, the virus, COVID-19, may experience a lingering impact of the virus. For some, it might include a bit of brain fog, short-term memory issues, difficulty reading and writing, as well as continued muscle pain and also difficulty breathing. For others, and this really is important that you are very clear about what the treatment was, but for anyone who was in an intensive care unit, and in particular who had any kind of intubation, one of the consequences that is really coming to the fore is an experience of delirium. Delirium, which is a direct result of an ICU experience. And so with delirium, we're talking about a serious change in the brain that causes mental confusion, emotional disruption, and make it difficult for that person, that man or woman, that sister or brother, to think, to remember, to sleep, even to pay attention to simple things. So it becomes really important for those of you who've had members recover to understand what the treatment was and to understand the ongoing lingering impact of the virus. I wish it could say, I could say that it's when it's over, it's over. But we know that that's not true for many men and women. So a little pause. What was helpful for you to hear? And you might want to address that to yourself personally. I'm talking about you personally, even if you're in a leadership role, which many of you are. What did you need to hear? Or as I say often, what has your name on it? And can you say to yourself why? You may want to take a look at these pages that you have in front of you, and you may want to go back and put an X or circle something, and that says to you, I'm going to go back and look at that again. What conversations do you want to engage in as follow-up? And with whom? We talk about conversations within a leadership group. We talk about conversations with individual members. The conversations may be with some of your staff, the men and women who accompany your members on a daily basis. And what would you want? What would the conversation entail? And then what are some possible next steps for you, your coworkers, and your members? And I word it that way because you can choose to act, to make some decisions, to act in certain ways. You certainly want to empower your coworkers, the men and women who accompany your sisters and brothers in whatever way, whether it's the food service or whether it's the housekeeping or the nurses. And then, of course, the individual members, how do you want to be in relationship with them in the days to come? So just to pause, just to kind of take in what we've been sharing there. Because many of you are in leadership roles with the added responsibility of caring not only for yourself, but for others. Some thoughts about being a leader in a time of crisis seems appropriate and hopefully helpful to you. And by the way, with everything we've talked about, I always say if there's one thing you hear that is helpful, then I've done a good job. If there's more than one, yay. So leadership in a time of crisis. These are some of the particular challenges with this crisis, with COVID-19. Keeping the community safe. Keeping the community informed with trustworthy information. Learning how to restart daily life when and how that is going to be allowed or you can choose. Dealing with economic disruptions, dealing with staff challenges and other challenges, and managing the secondary effects of social distancing and quarantine, which is what we just talked about. What happens when we have this change in our life? Ultimately, leaders are called to the larger questions of how is this time a time of change, redirection, letting go, and opportunity to rediscover purpose, both for individual members and for the community. I think it's so important that we keep in mind this is not just about us, and yet it is intimately about us. It is not just about individual members, but it's about the community as a whole. And it's important that at some point we need to get to the larger questions of how is God inviting us to the more? Going back to life as it was, first of all, I don't believe it's an option. And secondly, we're going to go through all of this and go back and be the same. So it's important, I think, for leaders to understand what is needed to and effective, what are needed and respective responses in some core areas. The first area I'd like to talk about is clear and trustworthy communication. A lot of what we're going to describe here is how to be trustworthy, which is how our members will and then accompany, walk with us, and believe in us. This probably is the most essential element in crisis leadership. Communication needs to be transparent, honest, and delivered empathically. And you know, my brothers and sisters, what we're seeing in the national level in this country is hardly transparent, honest, and delivered empathically on many occasions. So what are some specifics here? Let's try to be very concrete. I think listening to each person's story becomes critical. Listening to each person's story. Leaders and helpers need to be worthy to hear another's story. You need to be worthy to hear their story. And the only way you can be worthy is if you are honest, if you are vulnerable, and if you really are humble and willing to listen and really believe that you don't know it all. It's not a time, as Brene Brown talks about armoring up. put your armor on and go in there and you have the answers and you know what to do. I don't think so. Learning how to listen becomes critical. What we have learned is stories are more important than data, and listening is more important than telling. So can you be that avid listener, making time for, whether it's with an employee or whether it's one of your members? Secondly, I think learning how to deliver bad news if needed. I know one of the community I was dealing with, they were ready to begin to change the daily routine, and then there was a COVID diagnosis, and so they had to extend the quarantining. Nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to hear an extension of stay at home or an increased need to quarantine. The number of persons who are ill and any deaths impact everyone, including our employees, people who work with us. So withholding information, that's the next piece. Withholding information leads to mistrust and increases uncertainty and anxiety. And lost trust is pretty hard to regain. So I think you want to be wise in how much information you share and when you share it. But it does so important to not withhold information and then it gets sprung on people. When we withhold information, it leads to uncertainty and anxiety. And we really need to anticipate what we think is coming without, encouraging people to be more anxious. A heads up to what is coming. Do not be premature about, saying things, but at the same time, I think an honest answer is, I'm not sure, sister, about what we're going to do next. That's an honest thing. I think one of the things that really is critical is when you minimize uncertainty, it's not genuine and it's not honest. It's important that if you're uncertain about something, that you say it. And the more if we acknowledge uncertainty, then I think people can trust us more. Anxiety is an appropriate response to uncertainty. And so being uncertain and you're being uncertain and being able to hold the uncertainty will help others. I think learning how to reassure in the midst of ambiguity is a critical skill. Learning how to reassure in the midst of ambiguity. And how do you do that? Well, I think it's by being empathic, by acknowledging this is hard for them, as it is hard for you. Speak to the emotional reality. This is challenging, sisters. I feel challenged. I'm uncertain. And then being able to allow their uncertainty to be okay. Do not be stoic. And that's that armoring up that Brene Brown talks about. I think it's also important that you don't avoid data. I don't think you need to overwhelm them with data, but I think enough facts, enough information to understand what's happening is important. So your job is to consider what is relevant information and when to provide. I think one last piece in this area, a couple last things, is this. I think we're called to be vulnerable and humble. Vulnerable and humble. Being uncertain, not knowing, listening, really believing that others have something to teach us, including our members have something to teach us. I think that will go a long way in this clear and trustworthy communication that we're trying to be about. And then if it's appropriate, you would engage the media, and that just depends on what's happening. I think what I just described are really the qualities of being trustworthy, authentic, consistent, compassionate, kind, and connected and humble. Clear and trustworthy communication. I also think it's important that you feel free, for those of you who are in positions of authority and leadership, to get some help to address the unhelpful strategies that are used to cope with coronavirus 19, COVID-19. It really is a sign of strength and that an ability to ask for help. I think let's utilize other congregations, women and men from other congregations. You know, for example, it might be helpful to have someone come in and talk about some of these feeling responses like anxiety and how appropriate it is, and give permission to feel what people are feeling. You may not have the resource yourself, but there are other resources. And I think it speaks well for all of you, the hundreds of you who are online right now, because you know seeking help was a good thing, and hopefully what we're talking about is helpful. I think in addition to that, all those areas around communication, I think really I'd use two other words about leadership: readiness and presencing or being present. So let me say those again: readiness and presencing or being present. I think your job in a leadership role is to be ready, to know yourself, to know your members and your co-workers, and they are really critical because some of them see the sisters every day and you might not, and to be present to yourself and others. One of the important realizations is that it's not just up to you. I know we ask a lot of leaders. And I love Margaret Wheatley's one of her recent writings, where she said leaders need to learn how to be a host, not a hero. To be able to work collaboratively and empower all persons, co-workers, and your members. And so I think it's such an important thing to be able to be, as you said, to be not just the person who's responsible for everything, et cetera, but in fact, you work with others. So I love her challenge, invitation. Let us be hosts, not heroes. I think being about self-care every day becomes critical. I used 4 words there: move, nourish, connect, be. These are words that you can also use with your members. So I invite you to first think about them as your choices, and then think about them as choices that you invite your members to. Let's take a look at them briefly. They are move, nourish, connect, be. Remember first about you and then about your members. Our bodies need to move. I don't know about you, but I've been sitting a lot in front of this computer because of my life has changed as far as when and how I present. But I think we need to stretch and reach and twist and bend and step and sweat to whatever degree we are capable. And I think we have to encourage our women and men to do this. And by the way, this is not just about staying in shape, although I hope it's helping me and you stay in shape, but it's really about our immune health. So it's about 20 minutes a day, and you can use YouTube for workouts. You can dust off your treadmill, which I did, okay? And I think, it's really so important to understand that it can have a direct impact on depression for many. And an interesting learning for me is this whole question of shaking and dancing. And one of the things I've learned more recently, that our indigenous people have been shaking for hundreds of years. And that has a direct impact on how we feel and our immune system. So let us get all up there and let's learn to do some shaking and doing it, in a way that doesn't harm anybody, for sure. Move, nourish. And I think we're talking about nourishment in 3 ways. We're talking about nourishment of body, mind, and spirit. So really, what foods help you to live lively, feel focused, feel resourceful and sane? And I think something that's fun too every once in a while, you know? So I think watching our binge eating or thoughtless eating, we all can get into it. You know, people are talking about the COVID-15. You know, we've always learned about the freshman 10 or whatever, but now we're talking about the COVID-15. You know, it is a time to really watch what we're ingesting in many ways, and that includes substances of any kind. We also need to nourish our mind. What are you reading? What are you putting in there? Are you learning something new every day? Even if it's a word, you know, we can't just be focused on work all the time. So what other kind of reading that helps us relax? And then with that, we're also talking about our emotional life. And we've been talking about that today, and how important it is to pay attention to our feelings. And I think the important thing is whatever the feeling is, to accept, then investigate, and then live with its meaning. Live with that so we don't react. So I'll say that again, it's accept and investigate and live with what it's trying to tell us, and then move with that to some kind of next step without reacting. And I think finally, our spiritual life. How are you inviting God to be with you these days? I certainly have had added time for prayer and reflection and reading, and I really feel so grateful for that, even though the isolation and the quarantining has been challenging. My spiritual life is in a better place. I'm in a better place. The connect, more than ever, my brothers and sisters, more than ever, in stressful times, we need to feel connected. We need to feel seen, heard, and understood. Let me say those three words. We need to be seen, heard, and understood. And it won't just happen. We need to choose when and how and with whom it is important to connect with. So vulnerable truth-telling and truly listening empathically are essential. And we've got to be able to use technology right now, to use technology in a more creative way to help us connect with others. And then be. This is, I think, particularly true for leaders. Be amid all the doing. Just listen to this. Be amid the preparing, the protecting, the adjusting, the coping, the responding, the providing, the procuring. Wow. We need moments to be. Pausing long enough for our nervous systems to come to some kind of baseline. And for those of you who are practitioners of mindfulness, this is a good time. This is a big help here. So for you personally, how in the days to come are you moving and nourishing, connecting and being? And can you deliver that message to your members and really invite them to those four critical things? I think in addition, when we talk about you, managing your internal experience becomes so important. If you're not dealing with your own questions, your own feelings, if you're not asking yourself, what's this emotional response about? Why am I so frustrated? And if you're not looking at how your emotions are impacting your decision-making, you know, am I so riddled with fear that I'm trying to control people? And is fear, for example, limiting my ability to think about creative solutions or to take risks? This is a time when we could try to buy safety as the major thing, but it's also a time for risk taking and for moving forward, whether it's about a project or just about, you know, seeing how we are together. So I think what's really important is knowing what helps you stay grounded becomes critical here. I think also having a learning mindset. This is an opportunity for you, your coworkers, and the community to grow, to see opportunity, not just problems. Although we are dealing with very difficult situations that demand our attention. Crises push us in ways that we don't ordinarily get pushed. They can help us discover strengths and abilities undiscovered And by the way, not just undiscovered in you, but in your coworkers in your leadership group, in your people who work with you in helping the sisters, and in the individual members themselves. We do not have to treat them as helpless. I think an important thing is to be able to admit mistakes and learn from mistakes. Nobody has done this perfectly. Believe me, it has not been a perfect journey, and we need to be okay with it not being perfect, admit the mistakes, and move forward. And then I think learning how to support people you lead by being present and listening to them, not only to what they say, but how they feel. And what's really important is to pay attention to nonverbal behavior. Nonverbal behavior, their tone of voice, their facial expressions, their body language, which contains about 90% of the message. And a piece of new information is this, that tone of voice carries about 30% of the message. So you want to be mindful of your own tone of voice when you're answering a question or responding to someone or asking a question. I think a very important thing that you can help members do is create a reasonable, flexible schedule to replace what no longer is. By the way, that's true for you too. You need a reasonable, flexible schedule, something that can change on a daily basis, but it is a structure that helps you do what? Alleviate anxiety. Why does it alleviate anxiety? Because it gives you some sense of control. I can choose this. I can do this. I have the ability to do this. So again, helping your members with structure can be helpful. I think also one of the biggest final things I would say here in this section is learning how to lead not for compliance, but with compassion. I think leading with compassion is really challenging when in fact we are asking our members to comply, to follow the mitigating procedures, distancing, quarantining, mask and face coverings, hand washing. It is so critical that they do those things to keep our communities safe. So the question is, how best do you motivate? How best do you help people adapt, develop, persevere, and perform? Listen to those, to adapt, develop, persevere, and perform what is needed to promote safety and well-being, and be patient. And by the way, patience is a big thing for you and me and all of us. So I think leading for compliance aims at getting a person to do something, to do the external standards. And so we talk about what they should be doing. We can get into that. They should be. It often doesn't work in periods of distress and volatility, which is what we're dealing with. And it can lead to negative consequences. They become more defensive, more oppositional, more closed, and they remove themselves, if not physically, emotionally, cognitively. So what does leading with compassion look like? Helps others to uncover or discover their own ideas, feelings, hopes, desires, and is more supportive of their efforts to adapt and change. So notice what I said, we support their efforts. They may not be perfect, but we notice and we let them know that we notice. It also requires that you suspend judgments and affirm efforts as genuine as they can, and also that you express gratitude in a genuine way. I can't tell you enough how suspending judgments becomes critical here. I'm learning how to say, she's doing the best she can. Doesn't mean you don't keep encouraging the safety measures or other measures like self-care. Those are all still important. She's doing the best she can. Then when I go in there, I go with a different tone of voice, etc. Gratitude, an expression of gratitude, is really so critical now, absolutely critical. So I'm offering you a little bit of a way of approaching compassion or leading with compassion that I've adapted from a book called Helping People Change, and which I have found helpful. So it really, using the mnemonic REACH, helps us to remember the steps. So the steps are resonance, empathy, awareness, compassion, hope, and humor. So the H gets 2. So what do we mean by resonance? It's sort of, we're saying some of the things we've already talked about. The goal here is to create supportive, trusting, positive relationships. Our life as religious is about relating with one another in loving, caring ways, just as Jesus himself did. So focusing on relationships becomes central. Focusing on the other, not yourself, reaching out, connecting with them, connecting with their thoughts and feelings and experience. And I think it's so important, don't assume you know. Don't assume you know. And that's why it's so important that you ask. Stories are more powerful than data. Let me give you 2 examples. This is real-time stuff. Jane Dutton from the University of Michigan says, it only takes 40 seconds of a caring interaction to change a person in a way that affects their whole health journey. I might say their whole life journey. 40 seconds. And then we're learning something. There is a wonderful, a small article out recently called The Keepers of the House. What we're learning from the ICU units, the impact of the housekeepers on the life and well-being of patients critically ill. They are often the less heralded workers, but they are providing some healing moments. Not too long ago, a man who survived the ICU unit and intubation told an interviewer that he is alive because the housekeeper kept encouraging him, you're going to make it. You're going to make it. She was the only one available to be able to say that, given how family and friends are not allowed. So resonance, creating supportive, trusting relationships. Empathy. This is a shift from wanting to be understood to wanting to understand. Putting ourselves in their shoes, that's the typical definition. And so we have to hear, what are they asking? What do members and coworkers have to say? What do they have to teach us? And I thought an interesting distinction in this book was frequently we are about perspective giving and not perspective getting. And so perspective getting is about asking and inquiring, not perspective taking, which is our telling them how we see it. Asking, inquiring, what do you need? What's happening? What are you thinking about these days? It requires, empathy truly requires us not knowing everything and seeking to know and understand. And the final thing here, and I have found this myself, I thought it was a particularly poignant insight. When we ask if we feel more vulnerable. So a lot of times we prefer to take action or to tell. And that's when we armor up and we can be in charge. But when we ask, what do you need? What's happening? It comes from a more vulnerable place. And so making peace with being vulnerable becomes critical. So there's our E, empathy. Awareness is the third one, and self-awareness, being in touch with your own mindset, how you're thinking about things, your own feelings in particular, and the impact on others becomes critical. Remembering your feelings are contagious. So are other people's. So if you've got everybody up in arms, being anxious and that's all that's being expressed as anxiety, then we're going to have more anxiety. I think knowing how to soothe and relax yourself so that you can come with a calming presence. With a calming presence. It doesn't mean you know everything. It doesn't mean you're not expressing doubts or uncertainty, but your presence is calm. The C is for compassion. To be compassionate is to feel with. And the way we feel with is by focusing on them, their needs, responding in a meaningful way. It's about caring and warmth and tenderness. So when are the opportunities for you to be caring and warm and tender? You have to remember, those of us who are in helping roles and leadership roles, we have a front row seat to the emotions of other persons. They don't always express them verbally, and that's the critical thing, but they are showing us non-verbally what they're feeling. So a compassionate response follows listening and then more likely responding to the emotions behind the words. Don't ignore the emotion. That's the most important thing to respond to. And it also fits with empathy. An empathic response is usually a response to their feelings. We got two more. Hope. Hope, you heard me say earlier, hope and optimism are not the same, because optimism is not reality-based and hope is reality-based. And so we find ourselves envisioning or desiring a better future. That's really what hope is about, that our current life isn't perfect and we desire something more. And it can only happen if there are four things present. And this is the new insight coming from psychology, because hope is a virtue and virtues need to be practiced. So what are the four things? You will be hopeful if you're connected to others. Our men and women will be hopeful if we can help them be connected to others. Hope does not happen in isolation. The second thing is, everyone has to realize that they have choices. I may not have a choice about quarantining, but I have a choice about how I'm going to be in quarantine, how I'm going to use my time and energy. Choice. As soon as I say there's nothing I can do here or I'm a victim, I can't be hopeful. The third one is, I know how to care for myself and reduce stress and anxiety. This soothing, that breathing that we talked about, the calming things we need to do. Again, notice I have a choice about caring for myself. So each of us needs to learn what works. And then finally, the fourth one is, and this is interesting that psychology is talking about this, relying on a benevolent, loving, some higher power, which we talk about as a caring, faithful God. Help does not happen in isolation. It does not happen without connection to self, others, and God. And then the last one, humor. It decreases stress and increases satisfaction. It helps us to have a productive exchange and helps everyone realize this is not the end of the world, although it is difficult. And together we can do this. And so I would really encourage us to really think about how we can enjoy and have some moments of humor amidst a very difficult time, in the midst of doing all this time. And so I think it leads me then to this final thing. One of the roles of leaders in particular is coming to terms with a new normal and with transformation. Believing we're going back to what was is just not realistic. It's not going to happen. And so we have to talk about this new normal, whatever that looks like. And I think that is really challenging for people who like structure, who like to know, who like all of those things. And that includes many of us. So how do we see this crisis, and it is, as a wake-up call, a pattern interrupt, a time of change, redirection, and a call to us all, every one of us, to rise above the noise, to see the bigger picture, and to find higher meaning. It's a call to let go and to shift the focus from what you have lost. And we have lost a lot of things, including some of our dear members, to what is new, and it is about making a commitment to move on. Here is the opportunity to explore what the changes mean, what matters most, what you value, what is important, what's the opportunity here, what is God inviting us to, what our coworkers and each of the members of the community and you are invited to. These times, these difficult times of crises, transition, trauma, and it is traumatic, they can open us to transformation and invite us. And two things we must keep in mind: to find purpose again and connection at much deeper levels than we ever have in the past. So we will feel less oppressed and powerless because we are connected and because we are doing what matters. Living our values, living our charism, being concerned for self and our dear neighbor, and it's just not about us. And so I think this developing of deeper connections and seeing our life deeply intertwined with others will help us. So purpose and connection become conversations at the leadership level, for sure, and at the members level as well. So I'd leave you with a couple of questions and then an opportunity to say thanks. Again, for you to say to yourself personally, what was helpful for me to hear? For a leadership group, what was helpful for us to hear? What conversations do you want to engage in as a follow-up, and with whom? Who can be helpful to you? I think that's who do we ask for help? This is the time when we can share resources and help one another. And what are some possible next steps for you, your coworkers, and your members? And so, and this is because of the number of folks, we are not able to do some of the give and take, but I hope you do that with each other, and you're going to have an opportunity to give feedback to Hoffman. But I would like to say thank you for the opportunity to be with you. And of course, I personally, and I'm sure you too, want to thank Hoffman Planning for making our time together possible today. Many blessings to each of you on this next day and days of our journey. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sister Lynn. So on behalf of everybody at Hoffman and Sister Nancy, we also want to thank everybody who took the time out of their busy schedules to attend and listen to the wonderful insight that Sister Lynn was able to share with us. A couple housekeeping items. Again, Sister Nancy noted that we don't have time for questions, but we will be sending out a survey along with the link of the recording of this within the next couple days. So we please encourage you to go into that survey, give some good feedback to both Sister Lynn and Hoffman. And then if there's other questions that were not answered during her presentation, to please make sure to insert those in, and we will share those with Sister Lynn. And if there's anything that comes out of that survey that is a good follow-up, we'll continue to talk maybe with Sister Lynn about doing a part 2 or whatever else that we may feel is helpful again to all of you. So again, thank you very much for taking the time, and we're very pleased and happy we were able to pull this together and hopefully not have too many technical difficulties. So thank you and have a great afternoon.
I know.